Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Brian Anquist. I'm the Teacher Training Department Manager for Pearson in Spain and Portugal. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to this second in our series of 3 free webinars for primary teachers of English, empowering primary learners for the future. Yesterday, many of you might have been lucky enough to be with us for Sarah Davila's interesting look at giving young learners support by using scaffolding techniques. And tomorrow, our teacher trainer for Spain and Portugal, Elena Marino, will be speaking about why and how games can form such an integral part of the learning process, as well as giving us some tips on how to build them into our classes for maximum effect. But today, I'm pleased to introduce my other colleague in Spain, Michael Brand. Now, Michael's webinar today delves into the 4 C's. Many of us have heard about these key 21st century skills and their importance for our students' futures. Today, Michael will be looking at precisely what they mean for our primary students and showing us practical ways of developing them in our classes. Now, as I mentioned before, Michael is a teacher trainer for Pearson here in Spain and Portugal. We are here in Madrid today. Michael is quite a linguist, living in Madrid as I do. He speaks Spanish as well as English, but he kind of has a few more languages than I do. He also studied French and German at Durham University. He also did a PGC in modern languages. He's taught both in England as well as Spain, with experience in both in the public sector, the private sector, state-assisted sectors as well, teaching mostly young learners and teens. That's where he has most of his experience. So he spends most of his time doing teacher training here in Spain, and he has specific interest in collaborative learning, and you might have also seen him speak about using video creatively, which is one of his, I would say, one of his specialist areas that he speaks about quite a bit. So, Michael, here we are, me and you here in Madrid today. I'm going to hand it over to you, and we can see where some of our attendees are from. So, without any further ado, Michael, it's over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Brian, and thanks for the introduction. Good evening, everybody, and warm welcome to this webinar. Yeah, as Brian said, I'd be interested to hear where you're from, and this also will help you get acquainted with the question box as well. So, if you open out your kind of toolbar with the orange arrow on the right, you'll see there's a place where you can put questions. Just let me know where you're calling in from tonight. Okay, so I get some idea where you're from. Okay, so Bianca from Malaga, hello there, nice to see you. We've got somebody from Switzerland, Victoria, very nice. Croatia as well. Alcorcon, so down the road from Madrid there. Sonia from Madrid as well, so a few people who are very close by. I can see there's a few calling in from Croatia as well. Hello there, Alice in Russia. Okay, good. So I can see that we've got quite an international audience tonight, people calling in from lots of different places, and it's great to have you with us. Okay, good. So let's begin with today's webinar, begin with the session, which I've entitled Fostering the 4 C's, Key Competencies for Success. Okay, I'm just going to go over what I'm going to be covering in this webinar with you. So first of all, I'm just going to check that we know what the 4 C's are. Can we identify them? Okay, many of you, if you've read the abstract or if you know something about them, you'll be able to do this already. Then, rather than just going into an explanation, I'm going to present some classroom activities, and I'm going to see if you can spot which of the 4 C's are being developed in those different activities. Okay. In the third part of the session, I'm going to be looking at who coined these 4 C's, where are they from, what do they mean, and what do they mean to us as teachers, and looking at some general principles for including them in lessons. And in my fourth section, it's very much a practical section. So example activities, adaptable activities on ways to integrate the development of these skills into our classes. Okay, so that's what we're doing tonight. Let's begin then on our first section. What are the 4 C's? Can you spot them? Well, I'm going to give you 12 C's here, and I'm going to see if you know the 4 that we're talking about tonight. If any of you can't see the bottom of the screen, we've got compassion, courage, the Baltic, and competition. Okay, so that's what it says at the bottom. So in the chat box, if in the question box, feel free to put in what you think the 4 C's are out of which of the 4 C's we're here to talk about tonight. Okay, any ideas? Some of us think that we're going to be talking about critical thinking. Olena, thank you. Creativity comes up again as well. I've got collaboration from Anna, critical thinking from Melanie, curiosity from Alejandro. Okay, communication as well. Curiosity again. Okay, good. Thanks very much. So I think most of us we've got the answer here. I'm just going to move on to the next slide, where I've organized them a bit. So you can see at the top, I've got 4 C's, but that's obviously a different type of C. So I'm just playing with a sound. Okay, so the Mediterranean is close by. Living in Spain, I've been in there a number of times. Quite a warm sea. The Adriatic, I've only been in once. I went rock climbing in Croatia once. So I know we've got some people calling in from Croatia tonight. They've got excellent rock climbing in Croatia. So yeah, I was able to go in the Adriatic then. I went to university in Durham, as Brian said, which is in the northeast of England. So I've been swimming in the North Sea, which is absolutely freezing. But even colder than the North Sea, as I've been told, is the Baltic Sea. Indeed, in English slang, if you say something is absolutely Baltic, you mean it's really, really cold. Okay, so there are those seas, but that's not the seas we're here to talk about. Along the bottom, compassion, courage, curiosity, and competition. They're not the 4 C's, but or the 4 C's of 21st century skills, but they're important skills which I think are also developed. So if you work collaboratively a lot, you're likely to develop compassion in your students and the ability to put yourself in another's shoes. Creativity involves being courageous, and it does. You tend to find that creative people are also very curious individuals, so they go looking for ideas and they want to understand. I've also flagged up competition here, which is something Elena's going to be talking about a bit more tomorrow, and it's you may say at odds with collaboration, but I think it's also something we can integrate into our classes. But these are the 4 C's that we're looking at today. The picture that I've chosen should be clear how it reflects its C. Okay, I chose Einstein. He was very creative, coming up with a theory of relativity, you'd probably say. But also, he has lots of quotes on creativity, which are often used in seminars, teacher training seminars, to talk about creativity as well. Okay. Okay, good. So these are the 4 C's. On to the second part of the session tonight. So you know what the 4 C's are. The next question is, can you identify them in activities? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to present 4 little sets of activities for you, and you need to think which C is being developed in each. And you need to remember the order of those C's, because at the end, I'm going to open up a little poll and I'm going to see if we can get them in the right order. Okay, so let's have a look at these activities. All of the activities are around just a picture, as you can see, of these little characters. So first set of activities, the students have to look at the picture for 10 seconds and see what they can remember. So they work for 30 seconds on their own, then they share their ideas with a partner, then the pairs share with another pair, and then finally the groups of 4 who now have the same ideas share with the class. How many things can we remember together? Okay, so just have a think. You don't need to answer now, but what C is being developed there? On to the second set of activities. Have a look at this picture. What are they going to do today, these people, and why do you think so? Which is the odd one out from these 6 characters, and who would be your best friend and why? So again, have a think. What C is being developed there? Thirdly, draw yourself next to these characters and write a story about when you met them, using some of the vocabulary, some of the words you did or you came up with in exercise 1. And answer the question, what did the helpers team, that's who they are, have for breakfast? Finally, have a game of guess who. One of you in pairs thinks of one of these characters and the other one needs to work out who it is by asking yes/no questions. Okay, So those are our 4 C's. Okay, I'm just going to show you the exercises in order now, and I'm going to open up. So you need to have in your mind the order that the C's come in, and I'm going to open up the poll, and I'm going to see if we can get them in the right order. Okay, so are we able to spot these 4 C's in activity? So I'll just give you a second to answer. Okay, so just you feel free to vote in the poll. Okay, just a couple more seconds to get your votes in. And I'm going to close the poll now, and I'm going to share the answers with you. Okay, so you can see the last 2 options were the winners, if you like, so they got the most votes. The order that I'm looking for was the 4th one: collaboration, critical thinking, creativity, and communication. Some of those activities might develop more than one, you could argue, but I'll go through now why I chose the order that I did. Okay, so I'm going to hide my poll and get back to my presentation. So there you go. Well done to those of you who got them in the right order. Okay, so the first activity then, it's true that the students do have to think of ideas on their own first of all, but then it's very much what can they teach each other, what can they teach in groups, what can they learn as a class together, and it's not the teacher sort of imparting their knowledge. It's a very collaborative task. Okay, the second one, you're asking the students what you think they're going to do today and why you think so. So if you're asking them why you think so, they would have to look for clues in the picture. Okay, so it's making predictions on some kind of stimulus. Critical thinking is involved there. Similarly, if I'm asking them which is the odd one out, that involves comparing and contrasting, making links between the characters. That will develop critical thinking. And the last question, who will be your best friend and why? That will involve some kind of evaluation of the picture, of what they can see, and that develops critical thinking too. The third one, drawing yourself next to the helpers team. Many of us associate being artistic with creativity, and it can be that, but of course it doesn't have to be that. It might involve writing a story, write a story about when you met these characters. See, I've given them some kind of constraint here. I want them to use some of the words from exercise 1, and creative tasks in class, they're not a free-for-all. So it's not go and be creative. There needs to be some kind of stimulus and some kind of constraint. Finally, asking the students what they had for breakfast, they'll just have to use their imagination. And on to communication. So here, one of the students has some information in their mind, the one they're thinking of, the other one doesn't have that information, and they have to ask questions to get that information, an information gap, we might call it. So there's a reason for them to communicate. It's a communication activity, and it's a communicative activity. Okay, good. So there you go. You were able to spot them in activities, spot the 4 C's. We're going to look at them in a little more detail now. Who coined them? What do they mean? What do they mean to us as teachers? And a few principles for including them in our classes. Okay. So what I'm showing you here is the framework, so the 21st Century Partnerships Framework for 21st Century Learning. So the Partnership for 21st Century Learning is an organization, a non-profit organization. It's an American organization, a US organization. And to quote this organization, so the framework for 21st century learning was developed with input from teachers, education experts, and business leaders to define and illustrate the skills and knowledge students need to succeed in work, life, and citizenship. Okay, so this is has been integrated into curricula in the US and around the world as well. And again, it's just this idea that as teachers, we're not just imparting content, although our students will have to learn content, of course, but it's also we're equipping our students with the skills they'll need to succeed at school and beyond. Okay, so that's the idea. It's to do with transferable skills. Let's have a look at each of these skills in a little more detail. Okay, and we're going to begin with critical thinking. So critical thinking is to do with making judgments. How do we make that judgment? Well, it's going to be an analysis and an evaluation of information that we have at our disposal. It's also to do with making connections and links, as we said. And it can also be to do with being able to reserve judgment. So the idea that sometimes you don't have an opinion on something because you know you don't have enough information. And I think this is a very difficult skill to develop for adults. How often do we hold back and not give an opinion? So let alone a primary age student, okay? But part of it's reserving judgment. It's also to do with reflection, being able to reflect on what you've learned, and if necessary, to revise your judgment. So being able to, or being capable of perception change, or to change your opinions if new information or evidence shows error in what you thought before. Sometimes you can build this into class as well. At the start of a lesson, you might say to students to say, I think X about X. And then at the end of the lesson, it's, I used to think X, now I think Y. So you can sort of signpost how their perceptions have changed. It's to do with reasoning. So inductive and deductive reasoning, we probably recognize these terms from grammar. Inductive grammar being students working out grammar rules themselves, seeing the grammar in context, and deductive being having the rules presented to you and then applying them in different examples. Okay. Critical thinking then is important. I think it's an important life skill to be able to make decisions, judgments, and conclusions which are reasoned, based on something. As well as being important in school, later in school, and at university for our students. And in education these days, critical thinking is a hot topic, often in the context of fake news. So this idea of being able to evaluate the quality of information. I'm just going to show you an example of this. This looks to be an article in a car magazine about Mercedes. But it's not, it's a sponsored article, so it's actually an advertisement by Mercedes, okay? Where obviously they're going to be trying to sell their car. And they're only going to be saying good things about their car, as you'd expect. But Stanford University did a study, and they found that 80% of teenagers couldn't distinguish sponsored content from real news. So it shows then that young people today aren't very good at evaluating information. And of course, this can mean that it's easier for you to be duped, and it's easier for somebody just to convince you of something. Okay. Critical thinking at different stages in school. Now, I'm not saying in primary school, once the students are in there, we need to get them adverts from magazines and sponsored content and get them studying these things, of course. Critical thinking can be developed in different ways at different ages, and it can mean different things also. So for us, a nice way of developing critical thinking is to get our students categorizing. We can do this right from the start. Which builds critical thinking because it's to do with understanding and applying rules, looking for links, comparing and contrasting. Okay. Questions to decide the best option. So not only questions which have one answer. For example, what is the best choice of classroom pet? You might give them some options. A mouse or an elephant, and again they would have to evaluate the information, what they know about these different options, or what is the best way to get to school, your bike, the car, the bus, and decide on the best one. Okay, so developing critical thinking, questions with more than one answer. Again, to do with making decisions supported by reasons. So students will need some information to make decisions. We might provide that to them, or even better, we can get them to show them how to find that information themselves. Fewer display questions. So if I say to you, what is the past tense of teach, or the past simple of teach? I've got an answer in my mind that I want you to say. You're showing that you understand. That those questions are okay. We do need to check knowledge and understanding, but they can't all be display questions if we want to develop critical thinking. Getting our students to make predictions. So we might show them a picture, a page from a story, or a comic, and ask them what we think that's going to be about. Okay, they'll have to make predictions based on this stimulus, developing critical thinking. And of course, as teachers, giving our students time to think. So many of us, I think, or you often see teachers ask a question, if there's silence, we worry and we want to fill that silence, so we just provide the answer, helping our students, but we're not really helping them, of course. So giving them time to think, I think, can help develop their critical thinking and also their creativity. Okay. Let's have a look at our second C, okay, which is communication. Communication then is to do with making our students able to articulate thoughts and ideas, be it oral or written or non-verbal and in lots of different contexts. Now, as teachers, this is productive skills, we would say, okay? Also deciphering meaning. So it could be deciphering literal meaning early on, or more complex skills like deciphering attitude. These are the receptive skills, aren't they? It's also communicating for different purposes, and this will also ring a bell, I think, to us, because we teach functional language. So teaching a student how to order a pizza or order some food. I say pizza because I like pizza, or ask the way to the bus stop, or things that they will actually really need to do before later on, of course, in school, getting our students to write a persuasive essay, which might not be something we do in primary school. Okay, and finally, communicating. So communication these days, then, it's not all pen and paper, of course, it's not all face-to-face. In fact, many studies say there's more digital communication than face-to-face, but we communicate in lots of different ways through lots of different media, and our teaching should reflect that, okay? When talking about communication and what that means for teaching, I think it's worth pointing out here communicative language teaching, okay? Because we might think that we, if you like, automatically teach communication because we're languages teachers. That's what we do. We teach people to communicate in a language. Communicative language teaching is it's not something new, of course. It's been around for many years. But this idea that if all we were to do were to be explain grammar rules or get our students to repeat, then we wouldn't be teaching communicatively. So we're not automatically teaching communication. Communicative language teaching will involve some emphasis on what language is used for, so not just a focus only on how it's formed, and it's also on this idea of functions. Do we have in our lessons some real or realistic communication? So real communication might be, for example, a student writing a letter to another student in a different school, abroad or at home. Realistic communication might be the students doing a role play which was relevant to them, okay? And finally, do our learners have a reason to use the language and a desire? So a desire would be that the subject matter is relevant to them. A reason would be, like we looked at before, this idea of an information gap. So for example, if you say to students, open up your book, look at the boys and girls on that page, look at the clothes they're wearing, and I want you to tell each other the color of the clothes that they're wearing. If they can both see the page, there's no reason for them to tell each other what colors they're wearing, because they can already see that. So there's not a reason, there's no information gap there. So that's just a little point on teaching communicatively as part of communication. Let's move on to creativity. Okay. Creativity then includes idea creation techniques like brainstorming, so developing these idea creation techniques in our students. This idea of creating new ideas, but not only elaborating those, not only the initial spark, but this sort of following up on that, analyzing the idea, improving it and evaluating it. And importantly, those who are creative view failure as an opportunity to learn. I'll just share an anecdote with you on this point. I'm just going to get you to answer this in the chat box or the question box. And if you could tell me what Thomas Edison did, or what Thomas Edison is known for. I wonder if anyone knows anything about Thomas Edison. Okay, feel free to answer in the chat box. Melanie, you were fastest finger on the buzzer there. Well done, Melanie. She said the light bulb. Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, and supposedly he actually tried. He came up with 100 ideas to create 100 ways of developing the light bulb, and 1,000, I should say, and they all failed. And he only got it right on the 1,000th time. And one of his assistants said to him, "Why didn't you give up? You failed 1,000 times. How did you keep going?" And he said, "Well, I didn't fail 1,000 times. I discovered 1,000 different ways that didn't work." Okay, so that's very much his kind of his mindset. You could talking about a growth mindset as well. So he viewed this failure as an opportunity to learn. Okay, so it was a trait of a creative person. I said I'd look at some quotes on creativity. I've not chosen Einstein for my quotes today. I've chosen Picasso. So Picasso, when he was young, was very much a naturalistic painter. So he only started experimenting more in his 20s. He said, "Learn the rules like a pro so you can break them like an artist." So I've taken that to mean that we do need to provide this kind of guidance and some kind of constraints for our students. It's not a free-for-all, okay? Secondly, the worst enemy to creativity is self-doubt. And that fits in with the last slide talking about not being afraid of making mistakes. So this idea that the teacher creates an atmosphere in the class where students aren't worried about making mistakes. So every mistake is an opportunity to learn, okay, to find something out. And we can use those words. Okay, mistakes are a gift to a teacher, of course. The third quote I've chosen is from Beatrix Potter, okay, the author of Peter Rabbit and Other Tales. "Thank goodness I never went to school. It would have rubbed off some of the originality." So I don't know how much you guys agree with this, that school makes us less creative rather than more creative. Is it just that children are creative, and when we become adults, we become very aware that we live in a society with rules and regulations and constraints, and we know what we can and can't do, and children don't know that as much? Or do schools really beat creativity out of us? So Ken Robinson, to quote a more contemporary commentator, would certainly agree with this, and I'd recommend a few of his TED Talks on the subject. Very interesting to hear what he has to say about creativity, and he's very funny as well. And finally, one of my favorite quotes, "The message is the medium." So what is the message of our classes? Well, it could be the content that we're teaching, so the different vocabulary items and grammar, but more than that as well, our students will remember the way that we taught. So if we're authoritarian, that will stick with our students. Did we let our students give their own opinions? And in terms of creativity, I take this to mean that if we want creativity from our students, we will have to model it ourselves. Okay, so if we always do the same thing, the same standard activities, we never veer from the script, arguably that's not a very creative way of teaching. So maybe be unpredictable. It could be something so simple as, rather than getting them to raise their hand if they agree, or if they've done something, the next day is a clap, the next day is a stamp of the feet. One day they put their coat on the peg with their name on. The next day they need to put them on a peg in a different order, maybe their age or their height or their date of birth, and they have to ask each other about this. Okay. What about the register? We take the register every day. Yes, teacher, or yes, sir, or whatever it is you say. Are there any other ways of doing the register? Maybe they have to call out something they've learned in class. Or I'm going to show you a different way of doing the register, which I think demonstrates a little bit of creativity. So I'm actually going to play you a video here. And I'm not going to introduce it anymore. I'm just going to play it. If you can't see the video at first, if you just look in your settings, you might see there's a window mode button. You can try that one, although I'm sure you should be able to see it without any problems. So I'm going to get this video up for you. Okay, so there you have it. Okay, so it's not going to, I don't think I can quit my day job yet and become a musician. But that doesn't matter. I think it's young children, they don't really mind how well you can sing or play the guitar, I've found. And I think this is an alternative, a different way of doing the register. So it's telling the students what they're going to be doing in English class. They'll remember this vocabulary, of course, from doing it a couple of times. And of course, the last bit, I say their names, and when you say their name, they look at you and say hello. And they really get into doing this, actually. I do use this sort of thing from first to third of primary. Above fourth primary, they might find this type of thing a little babyish. Welcome songs, although I've done songs and sang songs with students all the way up to A-level classes, so 18-year-olds. Okay, but I think these kind of welcome songs work well at lower primary, and I think there's one example among a myriad of ways that a teacher can demonstrate creativity. Okay, good. Let's move on to collaboration. Okay, our last C. So the Partnership for 21st Century Skills includes collaboration within creativity and communication. So in terms of creativity, it's the idea that we're developing ideas with others and not only on our own, and also being able to communicate ideas to others. And it's being open to new ideas. So the idea, we're trying to get our students to develop an open-minded attitude rather than a narrow-minded attitude. And then in terms of communication, it involves assuming you share for group work, for collaborative work. And of course, a teacher here can fulfill this by assigning roles in a group, rather than just saying, you four work as a group and do that task, because we don't know who's going to do the work. Whereas if we assign roles, they all have something to do. It's about our students being able to work with diverse teams, so not always working with the same pupil or partner, and trying to develop on our pupils this idea of being able to compromise, so not always getting what you want, okay? Which is, again, is sometimes easier said than done with young people, okay? I think there are lots of benefits of working this way. So our learners become socially competent. So we're talking a lot about emotional intelligence in education these days. If we have our students working individually all the time, it's hard for them to develop their emotional intelligence. It's hard for them to develop things like compassion, being able to put yourself in others' shoes, tolerance. Okay, so there's real social benefits to getting them working together. Also, teaching now, well, these days, we've moved away from the sage on the stage, the teacher just imparting their wisdom. It's sort of the idea that students can learn from each other. So if we work collaboratively, they'll start to see that they can learn from each other. Okay, it's good in mixed ability classes. So sometimes when we've got students of different levels, imagine we get them all working individually, doing standard tasks individually. They'll finish at different times. One way, using collaboration is one way to get around this, so we can get students helping each other, which is beneficial for the one doing the helping and the one being helped. And of course, if we use lots of different types of activities, it won't always be the same students doing the helping, which is what we want to try to achieve. And finally, it prepares students for real life. So I've always, when I was a teacher and as a teacher trainer now, I work in teams. Very few jobs are totally individual, so our teaching should reflect that. And of course, many employees are looking for people who can work in teams as well. Employers, I should say, are looking for employees who can work in teams. Okay, good. So that brings an end to the third section of the talk, in which we've been looking at the 4 C's in a bit more detail. I'd like to move on to the fourth section of the talk now, which is just practical ideas to integrate these 4 C's into class. Now, this section is divided into 3. I've not divided each section into a certain C, because of many activities can develop more than one, but you'll see now that there are 3 activity progressions, all of which develop the 4 C's in different ways. Okay, so let's have a look. I want to begin with categorization. So I'm going to show you some items on a page here, some vocabulary items actually, and I'd like you to propose, please, in the chat box, any ways you can think of to categorize or to put these items into groups. Okay, so I'll just give you a second to do that. What groups would you put these items into? Okay, let's have a look. Colors, somebody says, toys, food, clothes, fruits and vegetables, means of transport, somebody says, healthy life. Good. There's a few more: food, clothes, colors. Okay, good. So I'm glad that you came up with lots of different ideas here, because of course there are many ways you can categorize these items. So you may have gone for clothes, toys, and food, some of you said. You could have gone for transport, some of you said, and if the doll is wearing clothes, so she could be in clothes and then food. Some of you suggested colours, which is what I've gone for here. Maybe even singular and plural, or one and more than one. So a few points to make about this activity. So here, of course, one way to use categories is to give our students the categories. Another way is to ask them to come up with the categories and or indeed come up with as many ways to categorize as possible. So you often find that the young people, pupils come up with ideas that maybe as adults hadn't thought of. Okay, there's no right answer here. Again, finding the odd one out is another activity. Someone mentioned it, which is similar to this, but it does involve making links and connections and comparing and contrasting, and it develops critical thinking too. So these are some ideas around categorization. I'm going to move on to some different pictures. So the last set of pictures were from a course book, and arguably they did lend themselves to be categorized in a certain way. These pictures then, we'll imagine that they're pictures of my students, okay? So these don't have an obvious way to be categorized. There are many advantages of using pictures of students in class. Principle is that students are very motivated, I found, to bring in pictures of themselves and to use them. So if you can get pictures of students into any activity, it will add an extra level of motivation because they'll be very happy to work with them. Anyway, what about these pictures? Any ways you might categorize them? So again, just feel free to put some ideas in the box. How might you put these into groups? Okay, I'm going to have a look at what you're saying. Singular and plural, leisure, thank you. Winter and summer, Maria, thank you. Hobbies, Christina. Free time activities, pets, thank you, Natalia Petrova. Let's have a look at some more. Hot and cold, nice. Sports and hobbies from Nuria. Gloria, every day. Thorana, sports, plural. Okay, so there's lots of ideas here. Again, there's no right answer. So what some of the ones I didn't think of as many of you as you did. I went for boys and girls, pets with a ball, cold and hot, more than one, or one. And so these photos, now that we've got them in class, I think there's a whole range of things we could do with them, of course. We might get our pupils in groups and get them, one of the pupils describes one, the others try to guess which one's being described. So again, this idea of a communicative activity, some kind of gap. Describing photos is very useful if you're preparing for external exams. So all the way from A1 level exams to C2, we have students working with photos, be that describing or hypothesizing later on. So practicing with photos in classes is good for that too. What about an activity like this? So you have 20 seconds to look at the photos. Your partner then takes them away. What can you remember? Okay. Now, just a point on remembering. Okay, so you might think, well, remembering, which of the 4 C's is that? Now, I've decided to show you Bloom's taxonomy here. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with it, and you'll probably recognize some of the words from the presentation today. So we've got create right at the top. We're talking about creativity. We've got evaluate and analyze at the top as well. We've seen these in the context of critical thinking. So these are what we call higher order thinking skills. And then we have at the bottom our lower order thinking skills. But the webinar today isn't saying that these lower order skills are unimportant. Of course, as we know how important it is for a teacher, for a pupil to understand a message or a word, or to remember or recall a piece of vocabulary to be able to use it. Okay, so if in many ways higher order skills are built on lower order skills. The students need to remember vocabulary to be able to participate in class. So just while we're talking about memory, you may notice, if experienced teachers know that we need to recycle vocabulary. We can't just teach it once. Our students will need to encounter it a number of times to commit it to memory. And that's why in lots of teaching material, a unit of work, the vocabulary is recycled, so it appears more than once. Okay. However, we may still forget those words after a unit. Okay, so there is a very strong case to be made to be recycling over the course of the year, and not only within a unit. This recycling curve demonstrates that, or this remembering curve that we do every time we visit an item. We forget. Forgetting takes longer each time, but we will forget. So this idea of dealing with memory over the course of the year, one practical idea which I've used is the memory box in class. So in primary school, could be something like your students have learned how to answer a question. At the start, things like, how old are you? Where do you live? On to, what are your hobbies? Tell me about your town. And when we've covered these questions in class, they get put in the box. And periodically, over the course of the year, we pull one out, or we get all of our students to pull one out and ask each other these questions. So they're revisiting what they've learned earlier on in the year, not only in a unit, but also over the course of the year. In terms of teaching materials, there are other ways to do this. So if you have a look at this introductory page to a unit of work, it's from a first year of primary book. You might see that the area of vocabulary is toys. Okay, many of you should be able to spot some toys in this picture. Feel free to just put in the question box any toys that you're able to spot. Okay, what can you see here? Let's have a look. A good truck, ball, kite. Thank you, Elena. Thank you, Laura. Beatrice, balloons. Thank you. Avra, we've got their ball. I think there was. It moves a bit quite quickly. But you can see lots of toys, of course, here. Let's move on to the second unit. Now we can see here that the focus is classroom objects. So if you look on the table at the back, there's lots of different classroom objects, but we can also see that there are a few toys around the room. So you might see the teddy on the bottom right and the bike on the middle right, and so there's a scooter there as well. So there's still toys there. Let's move on to our third unit, which is to do with your body and movement. But we can still see classroom objects at the foreground here, some pens in there. We can see the bike at the back. Okay, and if we move on to our fourth one, we can see it's about family members, but we can still see vocabulary from the first three units, if you like, in this page as well. So this is just a way of how we might build in this idea of recycling and spaced repetition over the course of the year into our materials. This particular page would be great then for to do a kind of a categorization activity. Okay, because we've got lots of different vocabulary sets. Okay, so continuing with categorization, I should say, we wouldn't only categorize pictures, we're also looking at for our students to categorize words. So this is a reading text. It's from a book from the 6th year of primary. You don't need to read all of the text. It's about students talking about their holidays or their trips that they've been on. So a way of developing critical thinking here is simply to ask some questions, such as in the exercise I've shown you, and get them to pick out the words which are buildings in a city in this case, places a tourist might visit, words we use for people. Okay, so you're giving them categories and they need to scour the text and pick out words to put in those different categories. Okay, again, looking for links between words, developing critical thinking. Alternative ways of categorizing with vocabulary, of course, is to give them vocabulary and get them to put that vocabulary into categories. So here I've chosen the answers from the previous activity, and I've also added in some past tense verbs, some adjectives, and some cities. Okay, and you could even categorize those cities into capitals and non-capitals. There's bound to be a clever clogs in the classroom who can do that as well. But I'm talking about students categorizing words, perhaps it's a bit vague. How might we organize these activities? What could the mechanics of these activities be? Well, I'll show you a few examples. One thing we can do is get our students to categorize the words in groups of 4 in this case. So they get all their words on the table in groups of 4, they need to put them in different categories. Then what happens? 3 of those members of those three members of that group move round to another group, and 3 members of that group move round to another group, etc. So we're moving round. 1 remains. And those 3 students who've just joined a new group, they look at the words and how they've been categorized, and they try to work out which categories they've been put into. And the team member who stayed there can then give them feedback on whether they've got it right or whether they've got it wrong. Okay, so this type of activity is very collaborative, it develops critical thinking. It's also successful because my experience, students like to create activities for each other and create little puzzles and riddles for each other. It doesn't only have to be the teacher creating those. We might get our students in groups to make sentences with the words. How many can you fit in a sentence? Introducing a bit of competition there. Or perhaps the students writing an account of their holiday using the words on those cards. Okay, so again, creativity, but with certain constraints so that they have to use those words. What about getting students to add to the category? So they may know more vocabulary. And of course, they can teach each other that. It's not only the teacher teaching that vocabulary. So again, how could we organize an activity like that? Well, one way which we looked at the start of the webinar is this idea that this sort of think, pair, share idea, where the students think on their own about any extra words they know to put in the category, then share with their partner, share as a group, and share with the class. So this is a collaborative way and a brainstorming technique as well. Another way of doing it is to add in a bit of competition. So here, imagine that I've taught these fruits and vegetables. Okay, there you go. You've got a categorization activity right there. But I want to see if my students know any other fruits and vegetables. So I get them to write down in the notebooks any other fruits and vegetables that they know. Okay, and these are their answers. Okay, so these are the fruits and vegetables that they knew, let's say. Okay, and of course, and then the competition element is that I award points. So as a 4, we will compare our words, and if there's a word that we all have, each person gets 5 points. If there's a word that 2 or 3 of us have, it's worth 10. And if there's a word that only 1 of us have, that word is worth 20 points. Okay, so again, there's a, let's see who's won here. We've all got orange. Sada's the only one with cucumber. Michael and Elena both have strawberry. Brian and Elena have lemon. Elena has apricot. Elena's the winner. Okay, so students will find this a lot of fun. Okay, adding this competition to the brainstorm. We could do this as individuals, or we could do this in teams, which sort of softens the competition. And further up, primary, if you like, if you've got a more complicated vocab set, means of transport, for example, you might have students will want to win, so they'll put in as many words as they can. And but then the other students don't want them to. You want to be the one who wins. So someone's put down a word, and you think that it doesn't belong there. So you say, well, you can't. No, you can't have that. And then the other person has to defend their word and say why it does belong there. So, like, shoes, that is, or feet, that is a means of transport, because you can go somewhere on foot or however they may put it, but it builds in a need for communication. Okay, so I think it's effective for that reason also. Okay, if we wanted to go to even further follow-up of this idea of categorizing, we've got these lists of words in different categories. How about students add a word to that list, somewhere in that list which doesn't belong there, and then pass their list to another student or another group, and they try to find the odd one out. Again, collaboration and building critical thinking too. Okay, good. So that brings to an end our first section, practical section on categorization, and I hope we've been able to see how we can develop some of the 4 C's through those activities. Let's move on to culture, and it'll become clear why I've entitled this section Culture in a second. Okay, so imagine this is the lesson that we're teaching. If you just have a quick look at the lesson, you can see that it's to do with the present tense, present simple and present continuous, and it ends up with a communication task or a performance task. You might remember the 3 Ps from Sarah's webinar yesterday, in which the students need to use the grammar, the present simple and continuous, to write about themselves, but say a false sentence or more than one false sentence, and the other student, the partner, has to guess or ask questions to find out which one is false. Okay. Now we're actually going to have a go at this. So I've put on the screen 4 sentences about myself. One of them, however, is untrue. Okay, so you don't know me very well yet. You've only been with me for about 45 minutes, but I'm going to see if you can spot the lie here. So I'm going to put a poll up, and I'm going to ask you to vote. Okay, on the lie. Okay, so which one of these do you think is a lie? Okay, feel free to vote in the poll. Okay, over half of you have voted now, so I'm going to close the poll, and I'm going to share it with you so you can see what you came up with. So many of you think that perhaps that I do look like I like riding my bike. That was the least popular one. The most popular, so most of you thought I was lying about going on holiday to Africa. Okay, well, let's see. So in a classroom, we would get our students to ask questions to find out the one which is the lie. So a low level, it would just be to rephrase a statement. So do you eat meat, or are you wearing brown shoes? Higher levels, you could get them to ask supplementary questions to try to work out which one was a lie. I'm going to show you a few pictures. So I do like going on holiday to Africa. I've been there a couple of times. I think it's a great country. So that wasn't the lie. And I do like riding my bike in the mountains. I wasn't lying there either. I'm wearing brown shoes. Well, I can confirm that I am wearing brown shoes. Oh, we've lost light. So I don't know if you're going to be able to see my brown shoes because I've gone into the dark, but I'm sure it'll come on in a second. There you go. There's a brown shoe. So that one was true. And this one was a lie. So I do like eating meat. A couple of pictures here. We've got the chuleton in the bottom left and the jamon in the bottom middle. Really nice meats in Spain, as I'm sure those of us in Spain would attest to. And if you haven't been to Spain and you do get a chance to visit, do try one of these things, okay? Okay, so this activity I think is good because it's a real communicative task. It's real communication. You're asking questions to actually find something real out about the other person. And it's also fun. So the guessing element is a game element, which adds fun to the task. Okay, good. So you'll notice there that we were talking about South Africa, and I'd just like to share a few cultural differences, some things that I found interesting when I went to South Africa with you. And I'm going to focus on linguistic differences. So I wonder if you know these expressions. Okay. To give someone a bakkie in British English or a bakkie in South Africa, what do they mean? Well, in British English, to give someone a bakkie is to give them a lift on the back of your bike. Boris Johnson, the Foreign Secretary who used to be the Mayor of London, got in trouble a few years ago for doing this. He did it on the streets of London, and it's illegal. So he had his wrist slapped for doing that. A bakkie in South Africa, however, is a pickup truck, and you see lots of those on South African roads. A robot. What does the word robot mean to you? Well, to many of you and to me, it might mean this. This is a robot for me. A robot in South Africa is a traffic light. So if you see the word robot on the road in South Africa, you can be a bit confused as to what you're going to encounter. But don't worry, it's only a traffic light. Okay. And finally, following on from meat, what's this? You might think it's a barbecue. In South Africa, you'd be calling this a braai. Okay. So those cultural differences, I think, well, I found them interesting. Maybe you found them interesting as well. And in my experience, students are very interested in these differences. So cultural lessons tend to be popular. They're also useful for developing skills or character traits like tolerance and attention to diversity and that people are different. Okay, and an acceptance of that, of course. develops higher order thinking skills, the comparing and contrasting involved in critical thinking, because we can look at the differences and the similarities between the country we're looking at and our own. And they really do lend themselves to projects, these types of lessons, which foment the 4 Cs. I want to have a look at an example of a project like this. So this is our lesson. You can see it's to do with sports and hobbies around the world. Rugby in New Zealand. Rugby is also very popular in South Africa, and of course in England, where I'm from. Singing in Wales, and then cross-country skiing. Some of you might be following that in the Winter Olympics at the moment. Very popular in Canada, and you'll see that the Canadians are winning lots of medals. Okay. These types of lessons, I would always have a map or a globe handy. Of course, you could project one onto the board. I found that the students are very interested in where it is that we're talking about, and of course they can also learn some geography into the bargain as well. This is our project. So our students need to make a class library of mini books, okay, about free time activities in their country. And you can see the instructions below if you just have a quick read of. I'm going to look at what I think are some key considerations when doing a project like this, okay? And those are, first of all, I think it's very useful for students to provide a model. So it could be a mini book that the teacher's made. It could be a mini book that a pupil who did the project last year made. Okay, and then you can show them the work from last year if it's the second time you're doing it. A model is helpful for students to have something to go on and to give them an idea, but also to build interest in the task. And if you show them the model at the start of the unit, it will give the practice activities a real reason sort of for being there, because they can see that they're working towards this project at the end. When doing project work, it's really helpful to assign roles. We said before that it's important that students share the responsibility, of course, and we can't just say do that project in groups. So it might be that we assign roles that require different skills. So it could be, for example, the front cover and the drawings to one student, the research to another, the writing the articles to another, or maybe we want them all to develop the certain skill. So if in our book we've got 4 activities, 4 free time activities, we would give 1 to each pupil. There are reasons for doing both of those approaches. But I think most importantly, students have to see that a project is meaningful. So for this library of books to be meaningful, well, what do you do with a library? Well, you take books out of a library. So that there has to be, this has to be used as a library. So how could we use it as a library? Well, our students could take a book that their group has created home and explain it to their parents, or they could take a book created by a different group home and then feedback to the class on what they learned. Or perhaps the students have got an exam and they can take the books home to study the vocabulary from. It could be that they're going to use this library, they're going to get younger students to the class and actually read these books to those younger students, okay, which is I've found these types of activities very effective. Both sets of students are motivated to do it. The younger students see the older ones as a role model, something they can aspire to. The teacher, of course, is a role model, but we're a bit more far removed. And the students presenting learn a lot of skills from explaining their books to the younger children. Okay, so I think all of those ideas make this project more meaningful, rather than just the project that's done in the book and never seen again. Okay, good. So I'd like to move on to the final progression of activities. You have to bear with me. I know we're running out of time, but please do stay with us for the next 5 or so minutes. And this final progression, I'd like to look at stories in class and how they demonstrate, how they can develop the 4 Cs. Okay, so first of all, I've shown you a picture from a story. I wonder if any of you can guess what the story is. Okay, can anyone guess the story? I don't know if I've given you enough information here. Feel free to put in the chat box if you think you know this story just from the picture. Okay, so someone has answered. Diane has answered. I won't reveal what she said or whether she was right just yet. Then I'm going to give you a task to do. So I'd like you to look at this picture for 10 seconds or so, and I'd like you to see how much you can remember it from it, because I'm going to question you on this picture. So be studying this picture, look at it very carefully. Give you a few more seconds. Right, question time. Okay, so I've got some questions for you, and I want to see how many of them you can answer. So again, please put if you're able to answer any questions, please put them in the chat box or in the question box. You're saying that number 2 is true. Some of you think there are 2 mountains. Some of you saying the bag is blue. Okay. Good. The last one says, number 5, she's looking for something. Someone says she's getting back from school. Okay, good. Thank you. Now, you'll probably recognize that one of these questions is different from the other 4. And the question that's different, of course, is a 5th one, because you don't know the answer to it. The other 4 have a right answer, and I've flashed those answers up on the screen for you now, but the last one doesn't. So this sort of question is a good one to ask as well. If you get students looking at clues, so if she's got a bag, a school bag, so she's going home from school. One of you said that actually. Then they're using they're looking for clues to come to the judgment, which develops critical thinking. And again, brainstorming ideas and lots of different reasons why she's entering the house. That's developing creativity. Okay, so we want to ask these types of questions. And well done, Diane, I think it was, who said that the book is Goldilocks. Okay, so many of you will know this story. Goldilocks going to the 3 bears' house, eating their porridge, sitting on their chairs, breaking little bear's chair, and then falling asleep in little baby bear's bed, I should say. Okay, before the bears come home. So this is some of the vocabulary, key vocabulary in the story. Would we pre-teach it? Well, we might, but we might not as well, because stories, again, are very visual. I think a lot of this you can work out from the context. If you're going to use the story in class and actually read it as a teacher, you can mime, you can really get into the story, and you can have students understand that way. So we'd be wary of pre-teaching too much. In terms of the types of questions we'd ask our students, we looked before at the idea of memory and recall and understanding, basic understanding, which are all well and good, and we should ask these questions. But what about questions like whether Goldilocks would be a good friend and whether you'd like to see her in your house? This involves students evaluating the story, which develops critical thinking. Or what would you do differently if you were Goldilocks? So this gives them a chance to be creative. Okay. Other activities, we've looked at categorization a fair bit today. So we can have our students make a Venn diagram, or make one for them, and get them categorizing the characteristics of the different people in the story. So we could give them the words, or indeed afterwards get them to see if they can add any words themselves. What do they have in common? How are they different? How are they linked? Again, building critical thinking. Okay. We might get our students to rewrite the story. But again, remember what we said about constraints and critical thinking, not just go away and rewrite the story. Perhaps we might get them to include some of the vocabulary we've been studying recently. So here you can see vocabulary sets. So I've got some prepositions, I've got some food items, I've got some adjectives to describe food, and I've got some adjectives, some emotions. So again, I might assign these to students or to groups, or have them pick these words out of a hat, and then they have to use them in their story. And the results can be quite funny sometimes to see how they've managed to get them in. Okay, as well as obviously providing revision of that vocabulary. Other ways of getting them to rewrite the story, we might get them to write the story in their context, so their house or their city. So again, here they're being creative, but they've got something to go on, the original story, and what they know about their house and their city. So there's something to work with. Of course, we can also get them working collaboratively with a write around. So the students all start their story and then they pass their paper around the group. And then they add to each other's stories. And it can be really funny to see the way that somebody else, or the direction somebody else has taken your story in. Okay, so that's another popular creative and collaborative activity. It may just be rewriting the ending rather than the whole story. Again, this can depend on level as well, and time that we have. What happens when the bears get home? Okay. So in the original, I think Goldilocks runs out. How else could that story end? Maybe they think she's really hungry and they make her some food. They're very friendly bears. Okay. Another way to retell the story is to give the students the letter of the story and have them draw the story or what it means to them around that letter. So G for Goldilocks. So here we can see the little house. We can see the 3 chairs and the beds and the bears, of course, and Goldilocks running away. And again, the students would use this drawing that they've made as a support to retell the story to the class or to their partner. We could decide whether to provide the key language if we wanted to, which I've just put on the right here. Okay. Other ways to develop creativity and collaboration around this idea of a story is to get the students to act it out. Now, how would we have our students act out a story? We could just say, in groups around the desk, act out the story, or read the different parts if we had it organized as a play. But it's much more motivating, I think, to give that a little twist. So it might be we have our students make little puppets and we can even provide them with a little theatre. So you can make a theatre out of a cardboard box. There are loads of ideas on Pinterest as to how to do that. And again, they can perform the story or maybe their version of the story for the class. Okay. And finally, and again, a sort of a variation on that theme is the idea of masks. So again, you can get them to act out the story with masks. So these are some I found on the shop on the internet, but there are free ones you can print out as well. And masks are really good because again, it adds a sense of occasion and performance to the acting it out. Sometimes means that shy students are more likely to want to do it. You can also use this as a reward. So they will be really motivated to do this, and I believe there will be volunteers. So again, this could be a way of motivating our students using masks. Okay. Good. So that brings us just about to the end of the ideas. So hopefully I've been able to, in the webinar today, give you an idea of what the 4 C's mean and hopefully some practical ideas for developing them in class. I'd like to thank you very much for giving me an hour of your time to be with us this evening. I hope you found the session useful. I'll just pass over to Brian for a second before I close the webinar. I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add, Brian.
Well, I'd just like to thank everyone for coming today. I mean, the question box was very active. A lot of people in there adding their ideas, so we appreciate that. We appreciate your attention for this time, and I'm sure you have come away with a lot of ideas. We also had a few questions about if there would be if you would have access to the recording or to the PowerPoint later on, or certificates, and we will be getting those to you. This may take a couple of weeks. It's not an automatic process, but we will be sending out emails within the next couple of weeks with certificates, links to the recording, links to the presentation itself. Okay, and I'll let Michael continue and finish up.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Brian. I'll just point out where my material came from today, my resources. So I've been showing you some activities which are from a primary course, 6th level primary course aimed at the bilingual schools in Spain. Okay, and the story at the end I took from a reading program which is called Bug Club. Okay, you can see on the bottom left of the screen the Pearson website. I'd just like to, just a quick point here, I'd be very appreciative if when this webinar closes in about 30 seconds, you could give us your feedback. I'm very interested to know what you liked, what you would change, and what you'd like to see in future webinars. Okay, so please do take the time to fill that in because it will inform future things that we do. Okay. Finally, we're not finished. Tomorrow, I'd like to warmly invite you to my colleague Elena Marino's webinar. I touched on games a couple of times today, but Elena's going to much more detail tomorrow on games, gamification, game-based learning, and it includes lots of adaptable ideas for class. And lastly, just pointing you in the direction of our blog, eltlearningjourneys.com, where we blog on ELT, ideas for lessons, trends in ELT. Perhaps that might be of interest to you as well. Okay, so once again, thank you very much for joining us, and I hope to see you in a webinar at some point again in the future. Good evening.